You might not have heard the term load factor, which is also sometimes called loss factor, but it's important. It indicates the difference between the amount of space you're actually occupying and the amount of space you're being charged for. The load factor is used to determine what is called the rentable square footage, which is the square footage that is used to calculate your lease payment. The actual physical size of the space you occupy is called usable square footage, which has nothing to do with the lobby, the bathrooms, or anything that is considered common area with other tenants in the building. It is only your office space within the walls that you occupy. The rentable square footage, however, includes other parts of the building. It includes anything that could be considered common area. For example, lobbies, hallways, elevators, cafeterias, and game rooms. These examples aren't necessarily common area. It all depends on whether you share the space with other tenants or if you have exclusive use. So the rentable square footage is important because your monthly rent is based on that number. Here's an example of how it's calculated. Let's say you're in a building that has a total area of 10,000 square feet, and within that it has 1,000 square feet of common area, which is a lobby, an elevator, and several hallways. In this case, the load factor is 10% because 10% of the total space is considered common area. So if you leased Suite A in this building, and it had a usable square footage of 3,000, then the rentable square footage would be 3,300 because of the 10% load factor. That means you would pay rent on 3,300 square feet because the landlord is going to add in your pro rata portion of the building's common area. One thing that complicates this is that the load factor is often not an accurate number, and in many cases, landlords will simply assign a load factor that is generally acceptable in that particular market. The reason this happens is that there are many different ways to measure a building, and landlords don't like to spend time and money in a dispute over the exact load factor. Hopefully your landlord has used the standards created by BOMA, the Building Owners Management Association. In that case, you can probably rely on the number, and if necessary, it's fairly straightforward to have an architect verify the number. If BOMA is not the measuring standard, then it may be difficult to determine the true load factor. This is not something to be terribly concerned about. What you want to do is make sure you have a good idea of your usable and rentable square footage so you can negotiate the lease correctly. I don't recommend going 15 rounds with a landlord over whether or not your load factor is 12.3 or 12.7%. If you think the landlord's calculation is either unfair or inaccurate, your time is probably better spent negotiating hard on the lease rate or other terms of the lease. One more comment about load factors. Be aware that buildings can have vastly different numbers. Buildings that have large, prominent lobbies and other amenities for their tenants can have much higher load factors than buildings with a simpler design. Also, the overall size of the building can affect this. For example, let's say you have two buildings that have a similar lobby size. One building is 50,000 square feet and the other building is 100,000 square feet. In the larger building, the lobby is a smaller portion of the building and therefore has a smaller impact on the load factor. So if you're looking at a small building with a large lobby or other large common areas, then you can expect the load factor to be very high. The most important thing to know is the difference in the load factor when you're comparing different spaces so that you can understand what you're paying for.